Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Senator Pat Gallivan, and I'm joined by a number of my colleagues from the Senate, Senator Rob Ortt, Jim Seward, Daphne Jordan, and my local Assemblywoman, Marjorie Burns from out Western New York way. And we are here today to call on the governor to help a number of SUNY students realize their dreams. We delivered a letter to the governor's office this morning about a situation that we became aware of through some Geneseo alumni, various constituents who reached out to our offices. It turns out that there are 12 student athletes in the SUNY system, 10 from Geneseo, 1 from SUNY Brockport, an area represented by Senator Ortt, 1 from SUNY Cortland, an area represented by Senator Seward, and the 10 kids from Geneseo and SUNY Geneseo is the area both the Assemblywoman and I represent. We have 12 kids that have qualified to participate in the NCAA championships in swimming, some divers, some swimmers. And while the executive is allowing them to attend, because of an executive order 155, they're not allowed to stay in a hotel in Greensboro, North Carolina. They'll have to stay in a hotel in Virginia. Nearest city is Roanoke, over 100 miles away. So these kids will have to travel back and forth 1 to 2 hours to their competition, puts them at an incredible competitive disadvantage. It's an individual sport. Competition will be going on for 4 days from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. The schedules will be all over the place. There'll be no place for the kids to rest. They still have their student obligations, their academic obligations, and it's an incredible hardship on these kids who have worked a lifetime to realize the dreams of competing in a national championship. And because of Executive Order 155, they may be hurt because of it, and it's incredibly unfair. Give you a little background. Back in 2016, North Carolina passed a piece of legislation, created some controversy, and ultimately led Governor Cuomo to issue Executive Order 155 that essentially provided that no state-funded or state-sponsored entity could spend money or spend resources in the state of North Carolina. Interestingly enough, a number of other states did the same thing or did a similar thing, and so did the NCAA. And at that point in time, after the so-called bill HB 2 was passed in North Carolina, the NCAA said, we're not having our competitions there either. We disagree with this. And so unless you, North Carolina, do something with it, NCAA will not hold any championships, any playoffs, any sanctioned events there. In 2017, North Carolina repealed HB 2. NCAA said, okay, thank you, and these events went on, including this particular championship. New York, though, and Governor Cuomo did not rescind Executive Order 155, even though the circumstances have changed. And now, of course, these kids are going to suffer. It's not going to cost New York money. The NCAA, as I'm led to believe, pays for all the expenses at the championships, the lodging, airfare for the kids to get there, getting back and forth. So it is not taxpayer dollars, it's the dreams of these kids. The Olympics, every 4 years, think of this, the world's best athletes and the leaders of the world set politics aside, and all of these athletes come together to compete on that international stage. We look recently at the Amazon deal, or no deal, and I think there's a little bit of a parallel. The governor pointed out that putting political interests first was inappropriate. And I would say, just as it was inappropriate there, so too is it inappropriate and incredibly unfair to make a political statement on the backs and lives of these student athletes. The letter simply asked the governor to right this wrong and allow these kids to compete fairly and help them to realize their dreams. And so I am going to ask my colleagues to say a few words, and we'll just go in order of the representatives. And then in addition, I had asked Senator Jordan to join us because she actually knows the coach at SUNY Geneseo. Her son is a swimmer, and I asked her to join us because she might be able to provide some insight in case you had any questions about what swimmers go through, competitions and things of that nature. So we will just go through. Are we seniority or left or right? Senator Seward, Assemblywoman Byrne, and then we'd open up the questions when we're all finished.
Thank you, Senator Gallivan. I want to thank Senator Gallivan for putting this together and really highlighting this issue. And I want to thank my colleagues from the Assembly and the Senate who are here today. You know, as Senator Gallivan said, very often we are here in this chamber and in Albany, we are debating and passing legislation that have very big political consequences, right? And we're talking about big philosophical issues and philosophical differences. But every so often, real people's lives are caught in the balance of these, whether they're laws or executive orders or the things that we're discussing here. And without getting into sort of whether the executive order was right or the executive order was wrong, or whether the North Carolina law was right or North Carolina law was wrong, if you look back at as Senator Gallivan outlined, these circumstances have changed. And so the executive order should be rescinded or changed because here we have young people who are going to North Carolina to represent New York State schools, New York funded schools. These are the schools that our tax dollars go to fund, and this is why in part we fund them. So these kids can go and fulfill their dreams and compete at the highest stages and represent New York and make us proud. And they really are impeded from doing that with this executive order in place. And so as Senator Gallivan said, this is really an issue of putting the politics aside, doing the right thing, changing or rescinding the executive order to allow these students to go to North Carolina and compete and represent New York State, to do exactly what the executive order didn't want them to do. They should be allowed to do. They should be allowed to go represent us and make us proud, and I think it's the right thing. And again, I commend all of my colleagues for highlighting this issue. I know swimming, you know, I always had to even be explained there, you know, it's different from other team sports. And so not being able to stay at the location where this is happening is a real logistical and competitive disadvantage for these students. And I think it makes no sense. Again, the circumstances should indicate that we can rescind this executive order, and I'm calling on the governor to do the right thing. This is the right thing, no question about it. Do the right thing, and hopefully he'll hear this message loud and clear. And so at this point, as was said, I represent SUNY Brockport. There's a student there who is a part of this team, and the next speaker, my colleague, Senator Seward, represents SUNY Cortland, and I'd like to ask him to come up and say a few words as well. Jim?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be joining my colleagues today in requesting that the governor rescind his executive order, or at least show flexibility there to allow these outstanding young swimmers from New York State, our SUNY system, to go to North Carolina, stay in North Carolina, and compete there on behalf of the people of the state of New York. I spoke this morning with the swim coach from SUNY Cortland. He happens to be the Democrat mayor of Cortland, Brian Tobin. On his day job, he's the swim coach for SUNY Cortland. He has an outstanding young swimmer on this team that's going to North Carolina, Kelly Davey. And he pointed out to me that this young woman, a great swimmer, qualified for this championship by 1/100th of a second. That is how tight and close the times are in this type of competition. And he pointed out, if they have to fly into Roanoke, Virginia, stay in Virginia, and then drive well over an hour to the championship event, his concern is that's going to put this young lady and the others on this team at a very serious competitive disadvantage because of the logistics involved. Just remember, 1/100th of a second. That's how tight it is. Every aspect of this is important to the competition. So I'm hoping that the governor will rescind this executive order, allow these outstanding athletes from New York to compete, and also be well rested and in a position to do New York State proud. Thank you.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be here today and to be with Senator Pat Gallivan, who's hosting this press conference and who's been running point on this issue. I've also gotten a number of emails and telephone calls from constituents and from alumni of SUNY and Geneseo, and they very much want their students to be able to compete. And they're right, they should be allowed to. I have a niece and a nephew who actually live in Roanoke, Virginia, who do swim and compete competitively, and I know the work and the effort that goes into it. I've been to a recent Virginia state meet where I know they start first thing in the morning. They go all day long between preliminaries in the morning. If they're successful, they're going to be in finals in the evening. These are all-day, very strenuous events. That's why it is so important to be close, where they can be rested and be able to perform at the best that they can perform. And these are our students, our college students, representing us, representing the state of New York. We want them to be there. We want them to do their best on a national stage. And I do call on the governor, along with Senator Gallivan and the other senators present, and I'm sure just about everybody else if you ask them in the Assembly and the Senate, to let our students go, let them be in that area where they can have hotel rooms, transportation, and do their best for us. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Senator Jordan just to comment because I think she has the most intimate knowledge about competitions and why it matters. Some might think, well, they can go, they got to stay, they got to drive an hour, hour and a half. What's the big deal? I think it is a big deal, and Senator Jordan can provide some insight, and I'd ask her to do so.
I happen to be a state senator, but I've been a swim mom for 19 years, and I'm also an active swim official, so I know the sport intimately. I can tell you that, first of all, you should know that in Greensboro, where the swim venue is, that is one of the premier swimming facilities in the eastern United States. And this event will happen again next year at the same venue, so we don't want to have this problem again. Secondly, I want to tell you how very hard it is to be able to qualify and compete in the NCAA Division III championships. Out of the thousands of Division III swimmers, this meet is capped at 290 men to be able to participate and 319 women. And when you think of that small portion of swimmers that are able to compete out of the thousands, it's a big deal to be invited to go and swim there. So I would hope that the governor, in making his decision as to whether he will lift his executive order, will think about who he's representing. The SUNY students who have really excelled under the New York State motto, Excelsior, or will he think about the political pandering of 3 years ago and why that executive order came to be? I would hope that at this time that he would choose the SUNY students. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Any questions?
Senator, you had said that the NCAA pays for travel, lodging, etc. The executive order only bans publicly funded travel to North Carolina. So why does the executive order apply in this case?
I don't have the executive order in front of me. I probably should. But I did review it, and it talks about state-funded or state-sponsored.
Okay.
So that's SUNY Geneseo, that's SUNY Brockport, that's SUNY Cortland on the back of the warm-up jacket. They're state-sponsored when they go there, even though the expenditures from March 20th through 23rd will actually be covered by the NCAA.
Senator, there was a similar executive order dealing with Indiana and a law in Indiana a couple years ago as well. And when these two were issued, this was predicted that this exact type of situation would come up in regard to one of those two states. Have you guys heard about this happening before? I'm a little surprised that in 3 years, this is the first time we've heard about something like this.
It has actually happened in New York before, and I'm not positive. It may have been Stony Brook golf team or baseball team. I'm not exactly sure. Provisions were made to allow for the athletes to participate, but they did have to stay at a hotel outside of North Carolina. And I think one of the things we talked about, to distinguish between the team sport and the individual sport, and this is significantly different because of the individual logistics. But interestingly, I knew that there was other states that have imposed a ban. I'm not familiar with all of them, but California actually has a ban. It's still in place, but it does allow for situations like this, quote unquote, exceptional approval. So they actually provide an exception when they'll look at things and consider things on an individual basis. And as Senator Ward said, I'm not here to argue the merits about Executive Order 155. I want to help these kids and hopefully convince the governor to do the right thing on this for these kids. The executive order and the governor's political statement are a separate issue for him.
Senator, to be clear, do you want the executive order completely rescinded, or do you want just an exception kind of made in this instance?
I'm here today, and my sole purpose and sole goal is to allow these kids to compete on a national stage and compete fairly and realize their dreams just as any other student athlete in the United States that's going to this is competing. I care about the kids, and that's my sole purpose today, is whatever means has to be done to get these kids to go. I'm asking for the governor to do it. He's the only one who can make the decision on this.
So an exception, not a repeal, an exception to the executive order.
Either way, he can do it however he wants. He can make an exception. He can repeal the executive order, he can amend the executive order, and any discussion about the executive order and whether we agree or disagree, that's for another day. So today's purpose is however he wants to do it, let these kids realize their dreams, give them the opportunity to compete fairly.
Have you had any direct contact with the executive
No.
branch?
So what happened, the way this came about is I had some constituents had reached out to our office. We then had representatives from our office back in the district reach out to SUNY Geneseo to essentially get the details. I reached out to SUNY to get the details. SUNY indicated to me they had several conversations with the governor's office. The starting point was that the kids could not compete. Governor's office acquiesced to say that the kids could compete, but only under this provision that they can compete in North Carolina, but they have to stay elsewhere. So because of what I learned from SUNY in those conversations, I didn't really think it would be, I don't know that I would have gotten anywhere dealing personally on a phone call with the governor's office, so that was the purpose of the letter to the governor's office.
Your understanding is that the initial position of the executive branch was that they couldn't compete at all, and now they've
As I'm told,
modified
yes.
it.
As I'm told,
What was
yes.
the timetable on that? Do you know? Like when?
I do not know. I only became aware of this earlier this week.
Senator, there has been a crowdfunding effort by some alumni of the SUNY Geneseo swimming team. Why would that? They seem to think that they can raise the money and then stay closer to the event with that money rather than some sort of public money. But why would that apply even if there's that state-sponsored travel ban there?
Well, a couple things. So while I was told by SUNY that the NCAA foots the bills or pays the expenses. It does become a question, though, if their travel back and forth from this hotel an hour, 100 miles away becomes excessive. It becomes an open question of whether or not the state might incur some expenses. I'm not aware of that. But I would simply say you've got alumni that care about this, might not be fully educated about the governor's executive order and thinks it has to do with expenses only. That'd be my suspicion.
So do you believe that even if they get this crowdfunded money that they still would have to stay outside of North Carolina?
Unless the governor provided an exception or rescinded the order, yes. I mean, SUNY is obligated. SUNY administration is obligated to follow a governor's executive order, and only the governor can provide the exception or change the order.
we know how they're getting to North Carolina or Virginia? Are they flying into Virginia?
When SUNY told me that their airfare was, that NCAA covers the airfare, my assumption is they'll be flying there. Exactly where, I don't know. I suspect we all logically think Roanoke is the place to fly into when you go there, right? But I don't know directly.
The NCAA is covering all expenses except the travel in and out of.
No, I was told that the NCAA covers the expenses of teams going there. It now becomes a question of if these expenses become excessive and they're outside their budget, because New York is doing something different than everybody else, it's an open question whether or not they would cover all the back and forth to the hotel. But the money isn't the point in any of this. As it seems right now, it appears that there's no expenditure of New York State taxpayer dollars, so it's simply a state-supported, it's state-supported, and that's covered by the executive order, whether it's dollars or not.
I wanted to add one thing. To me, it's almost irrelevant. Like, this is the dollars. If this executive order hadn't been in place, we fund the schools. I mean, this is something that we want them to do. We want them to go compete, right? We want them to go and. So I think this is more of an issue to Senator Gallivan's point. This is about they're representing New York, and as a result of that, they are prohibited from staying in North Carolina. You know, whether even if there was some incurrence of New York, I would be fine with that, because that's why we pay and fund SUNY through the budget process so that these kids can go and compete and travel and all that kind of stuff. So I just think it really, as Senator Gallivan said, this is about the sponsorship, and because of that sponsorship, regardless of other efforts, our understanding legally is that as long as they are there representing SUNY Brockport, SUNY Geneseo, SUNY, State of New York, University of New York, they will be prohibited from lodging in North Carolina.
Senator Jordan.
Senator Jordan.
I just wanted to add about the logistics of the race day, and this would go on for 4 days. Typically, the swimming starts very early in the morning. There's might be warm-ups at 8 a.m., which means that you have to eat breakfast, and the SUNY students would have to travel an hour and a half to be there for warm-ups at 8 o'clock. Or it might even be earlier than 8 o'clock, and then compete for a 4-hour session. And what the other swimmers would be doing is sleeping in an hour and a half later. After the first morning session of preliminaries, the other swimmers would all eat and go, really, they rest for like 3 hours. They just lie down and rest. Whereas the SUNY swimmers would eat, travel an hour and a half back to their hotel room. They'd literally have half an hour maybe to lie down before they're traveling again to get to warm-ups for finals in the evening. And so that puts them at such a huge disadvantage of not being able to have that rest time in between, where all the other swimmers from all over the nation would have that time. So it's so unfair, especially when swimming, you're talking about a 1/100th of a second difference in results.
And Senator Jordan, you have a son who's attending one of these 3 schools in the fall. What kind of conversations are you having at home right now?
Well, my son James is a senior at Shenendehowa this year, and we were at NISVA state championships for swimming this past weekend in Long Island, and so I did hear about this particular problem while we were at championships. And so James will be attending Geneseo next year, and he has been showing me, I guess, some Instagram statements that were put out. He texted to me from school yesterday, so I'm very aware of the situation. And my son is hoping that next year, perhaps he will have one of those qualifying times to be able to go swim at NCAA at AA champs. And, maybe as a freshman it won't happen, but he would like to do that at some point. And most likely the venue will be in Greensboro. I know it is next year. So, you don't want to discourage anybody because they're a SUNY student and now they can't compete. It's sad.
Senator, can you talk, and Senator Gallivan, you kind of alluded to this earlier, just the idea that these kids are kind of being drawn into the political aspect of this and how, from your guys' point of view, that's a little problematic.
Really simple. I mean, political interest should not be put ahead the service, put ahead of our service to the citizens of the state and who we represent. And this is negatively impacting upon the people that we represent for the sake of making a political statement and keeping a political statement in place when the facts have changed. It's inappropriate. I agreed with the governor in some of his statements about Amazon, that political interest should not be put ahead of community interests, and I think there's a direct parallel here.
Senator SUNY Brockport just put out a statement saying that they support the governor's executive order, and they say, quote, "There's no place for discrimination in any form." Does that complicate your efforts here? That the school, one of the schools itself.
Why do you think they put out the do you think they put out that statement?
I mean, I can come to some conclusions, but I'm asking you.
Doesn't affect my thoughts at all. I think it's wrong and it's unfair for those kids. And I go a step further. If SUNY Brockport is accepting of that for one of their students, they're doing a disservice to that student and his family or her family. Okay, thanks everybody.